Hello and welcome. My cat's on her way. Come on, baby. And there she is. Anyway, I do want to preface this real quick with saying that Warren is having an off day, so you might hear her in the background. I'm going to be saying goodbye to her pretty soon, so please just bear with me while I'm filming if she makes noise and you can hear it. Anyway, today I wanted to talk about bin cages. So I've been seeing them go around a lot in groups, and I just wanted to chat about it. I will say, first and foremost, I am not opposed to alternate cages or DIY cages, what have you. I do personally feel like there's a lot of ways to take care of rats, and non-traditional ways are not always the worst thing. So I will preface this by saying that. However, I do have a lot of negative opinions on bin cages, and I just kind of want to talk about. So the thing with bin cages is you're going to hear a lot of times that they aren't good for rats, and that's because of size and ventilation usually. So the thing with ventilation is when you make a bin cage, you choose how much ventilation there is. So you can do all four sides and the top, which is what's recommended. It's only not enough ventilation if you just do the top or just do the sides. They need a lot of ventilation. Rats pee a lot, they produce a lot of ammonia, and you don't want that trapped in the enclosure with them because the ammonia buildup will cause a lot of issues, respiratory infections, and then it also has an issue of if you don't clean it out enough, which you should, but if you don't clean it out enough and their substrate gets soaked in urine, they can get ammonia burns. So that's one issue with bin cages, a lot of people say, but again, it depends on how you do the bin. The other issue being size, and that's mainly what I want to talk about. You can get bins in all sorts of sizes. So obviously, if you go with a small bin, that's not going to be good enough, and you want larger bins. If you go with a small bin, you're going to have a lot of issues. Again, respiratory, enrichment, that sort of thing. Rats need a lot of enrichment. They get bored very easily. And the thing with not having enrichment is that's when you get a lot of behavioral problems. Having a bored rat can result in them being high stress, which can result in them having a lowered immune system, and they can get sick, they can get mites. They can also start fights with other rats. They can chew on the bars if you have bars, or they can chew their way out of a cage. They can become difficult to handle. They can try to bite you because they're very stressed. They can try to bite your family members. A lot of issues can be resolved just by giving your rats tons of enrichment in the cage. So you want them to be able to dig, you want them to be able to forage, you want them to be able to climb, you want them to be able to interact with other rats, you want foraging toys. Sometimes a wheel is a good option. Not always, wheels aren't necessary, but I do prefer them for my rats, but they aren't necessary. But it is also a good option for enrichment because they just like to run. Some rats just enjoy running. You want them to be able to sleep comfortably, so ideally you'd have either a hide or some hammocks, preferably both. You want them to be able to nest. Rats need way more enrichment than a lot of people realize because they are animals that get bored very easily. You could put a toy in there that they adore for exactly 1 week and then they never touch it again. That's how they are. It just is. So, my issues with bin cages. First of all, I do think that they're a good option for temporary housing, or some people use them for travel, and I think that's fine. Some people use them as a birthing cage, and I do think that's okay. Or a baby cage for when some breeders will use them as a baby cage for when they're very young, and I think that's okay. Just because for a long time there wasn't a lot of options in the States for larger cages. There is now. They do tend to be expensive. There's a lot of preview products that will work really well for alternate cages for that kind of thing, but they are very expensive. So they range in price from $100 to $200. If you need like 3 or 4 of those, it can take a long time to get that many. So I understand if you choose to use a bin cage for that. I also see some people who use them as like a hospital cage or an intro cage. All of that I think is fine because again, whether or not it's ventilated well depends on how you do it. My issues with bin cages start with the fact that I have seen many people who have both males and female rats kept in a bin cage, and the female rat breaks out of her bin and into the male bin, and then they end up with accidental litters. I've seen that a lot, especially with backyard breeders. Now, if you have both males and females and you have bin cages, it's not a guarantee. it is more likely because the top of the bin is not as secure as a cage door. My other issue is size, because yes, you can get a large bin, you can get a tall bin. However, if you put enough ventilation in there, you don't always have enough room for bedding. And the reason we're sitting here talking today is I saw people arguing, and a lot of people were making the argument that the minimum size requirement for a rat, the minimum height requirement for a rat, is 7 inches. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have an idea of how tall that is, but this is it. They say this is the minimum height requirement for a rat cage. Of my 19 rats, which includes 3 babies that are almost 13 weeks old, only 2 of my rats could stand to their full height in a cage this size, and that's the dwarfs. Everyone else could not stand to their full height, and that does not even include bedding inside the cage. So the minimum for a rat for bedding is 3 or 4 inches depending on the source. So let's say you're being generous and it's 4 inches. So that would leave about 3 inches of height, and that is how much height would be left over after substrate if you go with a 7-inch minimum height. Now, I'm not opposed to minimum size requirements for animals, for most animals, because it's the minimum for a reason. Minimum means it is the minimum they need to live a happy, full life and get the enrichment that they need. Most cages sold in pet stores are below minimum size requirements for the animals they are trying to sell them for. Now, the thing with rats and mice is that they are very frequently used as lab animals, and they are feeder animals. So when they say a 7-inch height requirement, they aren't talking about for your rat to live a happy, healthy life. They're talking about the minimum height requirement for feeders and lab animals. It is a rack that is of various heights with drawers upon drawers upon drawers full of rodents that only have the job of living until they are required to die for something else to eat, or alternatively to breed so that something else can eat. And enrichment doesn't matter for these animals. Food doesn't matter. They give them food and water, yes, but it's not enriching food. They don't bother trying to give them enrichment. They don't bother trying to give them a clean environment. They don't bother trying to do anything but keep them alive until someone else purchases them, usually when they're sick and not completely healthy, to then feed to another animal. And then lab animals are not required to have a lot of space because they are in a lab and they can't take up a ton of space. They certainly can't do critter nations. So, and that is where my issue comes from, because I do feel like minimum size requirements are fine for the majority of animals. I also think there is such a thing as too much space. So for example, my goal is to eventually have 3 groups and have a group of dwarfs and one of my double critter nations. However, it's going to take me a while to get a couple more dwarves, it's looking like, which I'm fine with. They're happy in here. They're getting along just fine. But if I get down to 2 of my standard groups and I still only have these 2 girls, I'm not going to move them into one of my doubles, because Junimo and Joja are this big and they could quite easily get lost in this cage, and if they have trouble finding each other, it could create a lot of stress. And you would think, oh, how could they have trouble finding each other? They can snip each other out. If they have too much space, sometimes they get nervous. It's not a guarantee. These girls are very confident. I actually think they would probably do pretty well in a double story. But it's still not a guarantee. And I've had rats. I've had a pair of girls. Their names were Clover and Caper. And I put them in a double critter nation. And they couldn't find each other. And they got very stressed. I had to literally physically move them closer to each other so that they would calm down. And they did calm down. But Clover never used the whole cage. She only used the bottom half, because she just did not like the space. And that can happen. And while I do think they would do okay in this, it also brings up the issue of, would I be able to find just the 2 of them in a cage this big? I sometimes have trouble finding them in this cage. So when there's more of them, it makes it easier in a weird way, because they just kind of follow each other to wherever you're going. Rats are like that. I do think there can be too much space, but I do also think that that minimum is not fair to rats. Rats should be able to stand to their full height within their cage, because they are capable of standing to their full height safely and they want to. Rats just often do that when they're trying to reach something or when they're curious or they just need to sit up to groom. And that's not their full height. But again, most of my rats are tall enough that that's not enough for them to sit up and groom their face with a proper amount of bedding. And yes, you can say, well, a bin cage doesn't have to be that tall. You can make them taller, and you can, which is why I'm not completely 100% against them. My issue is if your argument for why a bin cage is okay is that you're not actively hurting your animal based on a standard that shouldn't exist, you need a better argument. Genuinely, if your argument is, well, I'm not actively hurting them by doing this, that's not a good argument. You need to reassess what you're doing. What is the point of getting an animal, especially an animal like a rat that needs a lot more than people realize, if you're only going to give them what you feel is the most convenient for you? Because pets are not convenient. No pet is convenient. Even the simplest of animal takes up space. Even the simplest of animal takes up your time and your money. And there are more convenient animals, like inverts, for example. You could easily get an invert and have to do only a teeny tiny bit of care once a week. But if you want a rat, you should take the time to properly care for them. The minimum size requirement for a cage for a rat is 2.5 cubic feet per rat. Now there is some flexibility on that just because your group's going to be different. I don't necessarily think that every critter nation can house 9 rats. I feel like male rats need a little bit more room than female rats. I feel like dwarf rats don't need quite as much room as standard size rats. And I also feel like some rats are just messier and need more space. My cat is clawing my hand. Hi, baby. Some rats are just messier and need more space. Like when I had Orville, for example, when she was young, she peed on everything. Absolutely everything. And I had to completely redo how I set up their cage in order to compensate for that. If their cage had been at the maximum of 9 rats, it would have been a disaster. Everyone would have been sick all the time. And we don't want that. And you don't want your rat to escape or get sick or any of the other things that can happen with a bin cage, because they can escape a bin cage pretty easily, as I've mentioned before. They can just kind of squeeze out the top a lot of the time. And also the thing with bin cages, the way you make them is you cut out the sides and the top and then you zip tie hardware cloth onto them to close them off. And the thing with that is rats are very good at escaping. If they can get their teeth into the plastic, they will. If they can get their teeth into the zip ties, they will. If they can get their teeth into the plastic of the bin, which they can, they will. And you might get lucky and not have a massive chewer, but do you really want to rely on never having a massive chewer to make sure your rat is safe? I personally don't want that because I have this cat and my other cat who both sometimes just seem a little too interested in my rats. Even if they didn't seem interested, all bets are off when there's a prey animal and a predator animal loose in the same room together. Anything could happen. Even if you think your predator animal is just the gentlest, sweetest animal on the planet, accidents happen. I've been seeing videos going around of a pit bull puppy playing with a rat, and the thing with that is I like pit bulls. I genuinely like pit bulls. My friend Kendra had a pit bull. He was a reactive dog, but he was also, once you earned his trust, very sweet and loyal, and he just wanted to protect you, and he was the sweetest boy on the planet. But the thing with pit bulls is they're very strong. They are tough dogs, and even a puppy is a very tough dog. And just trying to play, they can very easily injure a small prey animal. If you have a bin cage, your prey animal could escape and then get attacked by your puppy. That's what I'm saying, basically, is you want a secure cage. One thing that I forgot to mention that I kind of wanted to bring up as well, the thing with plastic items in cages is they tend to retain smell a lot more. So I used to have those bins that I would use in my Critter Nation as shelf trays. And the thing with that is that I never fully got the smell of the rats out of those bins. Even using vinegar, sometimes it didn't fully work. And that is something that can happen. It's also one of the reasons I got rid of the plastic trays that came with the cage, is because once the rats had started peeing on them, it was just harder and harder to get the smell out. And that can just happen with bins sometimes. It's not guaranteed or universal, but that's another thing to keep in mind, as the smell can affect their respiratory systems. Every Mischief is different and every Mischief needs different things. So I'm not 100% opposed to bin cages because I do understand what people are saying, that you can get really big ones, you can stack them so they have more height, you can make them secure, you can make them well ventilated. I understand all of that. My main issue comes from the fact I've never seen a bin cage that I felt had everything a rat needed, including security. As a temporary cage, I have no problem with it. As a permanent cage, the problems start to arise and build up, especially if you're working on the assumption that your rat just needs 7 inches of height with an included 3 to 4 inches of bedding. That just does not work. Now, if you just need a smaller cage or a cheaper cage than a critter nation, you can go into reselling sites or Facebook Marketplace. A lot of time you can find critter nations even for fairly cheap. There are, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of preview products that work really well that are smaller. They have one that's called, I think, is it called the Ranch? I'll look it up and I'll put a picture up on the screen. But it is quite large. It's large enough for 3 rats, and you can fit a full-sized wheel for a rat inside of it without it rubbing against the sides or anything. The Preview 528, which is what I have up here, is large enough for 2 rats. I would be comfortable fitting even 3 dwarfs in there if you're getting dwarf rats, and it works really well. It does have a plastic bottom, so that is something to keep in mind because rats can chew through a plastic bottom. Still more, in my opinion, is still more secure than a bin cage. Also in the States, there are more and more and more cages that are trying to mimic the critter nation popping up. I cannot speak to their quality because obviously I am a critter nation girly. I prefer this kind of cage. But they keep cropping up and they might work, and a lot of times they're cheaper than a critter nation. There are options beyond just buying a brand new critter nation off of Amazon. And I do think that is something worth exploring personally because you want your rat to be safe. You want your rat to be healthy. My big thing with all this kind of stuff is that when the majority of people who have a lot of rat experience are telling you to not do something, that is worth listening to, even if you personally feel like they are wrong. You can do the research, you can look into things, you can make your own decision, and if you feel like what you're doing is the best for your rats, then feel comfortable doing that. Just also look at the negative side and ask how much there is to that. Should you be ignoring it? Everything with rats is basically a risk to reward ratio. This is the risks of doing this. This is the reward. And just try to always make sure the reward is higher than the risks. Alright, so that is all for this video. If you enjoyed that video, you know what to do. All the fun stuff down below. And I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye!